Now, more from Nielsen Sports, which has been examining the confidence levels of fans about returning to live events, and also, of course, listening and working with brands and rights holders alike to really understand where and how the value of sponsorship is changing in this new world. And I'm delighted to say we can now have our regular Leaders Week Direct chat now with Mike Ragg, who joins us. Hello, Mike. Very good to see you.
Hi, David. You well?
Very well, thank you, Mike. Now, we only have around about 15 minutes, but I'm going to spend just a moment of that time by reading out your new and relatively exciting job title. Now, International Head and Strategy Consulting and Research and Managing Director for the Asia Pacific region. So congratulations on all of that. I know you are a very busy man. So let's get into this now. And what are you finding? We spoke in October, of course, at the last Leaders Week Direct event. But what are you finding and what have you found in recent months as the situation around the world changes about fan confidence levels in terms of returning to live events?
Yeah, thanks, David. So, as you know, our Nielsen Fan Insight program talks to millions of fans around the world on a regular basis. And at the moment, 68% of them, so like 2/3 of them, believe that limited crowds is going to be the essential requirement for live events going forwards. And 19% of them, kind of 1 in 5 of the global population, say that they plan to return to events only when the vaccines will be available and administered. So that's the current status.
And what are you finding in terms of differences across different markets? Are there particular differences and similarities? What are you picking up?
No, you're right. I mean, obviously, different markets are having very different experiences of the COVID crisis. So to give you an example, at the moment, 54% of the European population are saying that they'll likely refrain from attending live events for the foreseeable future due to their kind of hesitancy around COVID exposure. But, thinking about other parts of the world, lots of different experiences. So we've just had the Australian Open, very kind of on and off fan experience there. Lots and lots of discussions going on at the moment about the arrangements for the Tokyo Olympics in the summer. So, really kind of very, very different situations.
And we're obviously in a position where, as you said, things are changing really quickly. And this is obviously critical information to understand where fans are at in terms of confidence levels for rights holders, trying to, if nothing else, make some sort of accurate estimation of ticketing revenue and what they can expect in terms of match day revenue. How are you working at Nielsen with rights holders, and what kind of information specifically are they looking for from you in terms of tracking how this will evolve?
Yeah, first of all, just to talk about, how the dialogue with rights holders around the world is changing. I'd say that, I think we're lucky that the 1,500 clients that we have around the world mostly are seeing some kind of light at the end of the tunnel now. But the reality is that the return to mass gatherings is going to be a gradual process, and it's going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. So in the meantime, we need to kind of focus on what we can do now. And we're helping our rights holder clients, first of all, track all of the media value, which is being delivered whilst the fans are away. And just to give you a kind of a sense of the scale of that, each of the English Premier League clubs collectively generated an average of 85 million of QI media value for the last season, where there were limited attendance just from the branding in the stadiums. Over the Atlantic, the NFL teams were generating around about 10 million per game from the tarpaulins that they're getting there. So, these are not insignificant sums. And another kind of like really interesting thing working on now is looking at some of the digital versions of events which have been kind of keeping us entertained in the meantime. And we predict that these will actually remain, many of them, significantly beyond the end of the crisis period. A good local example here is ADMM, the Yas Marina operator, launching the new digital motorsport competition V10 R League in partnership with Gfinity. I'm sure that we're going to see more of those type of developments in the region as well. And maybe just to finish on this point, looking forward to the end of all this, I think the reality is that even as the fans come back to the stadiums, there are going to be some major changes in security and safety protocols, which will mean that the experience is going to be noticeably different from the pre-pandemic era. So it's not going to be snapping back to what it was, what we had before anytime soon.
And Mike, what about mass participation sport, marathons, triathlons, etc.? Am I going to be able to strap on a wetsuit and do an Ironman anytime soon?
Yeah, I hope so, because I know how much you've been missing that. Well, this is almost one of the most interesting things that we're tracking at the moment. It's been a really transformative time for mass participation sports. If you think about it, 90% of the revenue for cycling and marathons have historically been generated actually on site. So the necessary switch to virtual has really accelerated integration of VR tech and gamification platforms like Swift, Strava, Ruby. So now when we think forward the next 3 to 5 years, we're now expecting that something like 70% of cycling revenue could come from these virtual events. Maybe 50% for marathons. We've also been looking at some of the work that's been happening with the Spartan race as well on virtual events. So a lot of things that we could never have conceived a year ago that I think are going to continue to be successful going forwards.
Mike, David and I ran a small pilot event in this studio last week, and we were talking about sponsorship, and specifically we were talking about disruption in the sports sponsorship market and the increased role that data is playing in sports sponsorship and the increased value that is being attributed to data. What's the market telling Nielsen about how the value of sponsorship is changing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think the main thing that the market is telling us, first of all, is that the value of sponsorship is changing very quickly. But also the main things that are driving those changes, already existed really before the pandemic and are really just being accelerated over the last year. The most important driver from our experience is the change in the stories that marketers are trying to tell. So purpose-based or cause-based marketing is becoming more and more crucial. So sports properties who've got a really strong game, standing up for social causes, and the communities, the fan communities that they serve are really, really well set. And that aspect is becoming much more valuable. Another kind of really, really interesting bit is looking at what's happening with a new focus on the power of athletes as social influencers. And our database of 96 million social influencers around the world includes this whole new generation of athletes who are going to be incredibly important to brands in the coming years. And maybe final point is that a lot of the sponsors which are coming in, the brands to whom they're going to be important, are kind of different from the traditional sponsors that we've been used to working for. So companies like Alibaba or Airbnb, just to mention a couple of the IOC sponsors, when you look at their objectives and what their objectives mean in terms of the value that's being generated, it's kind of just really, really different. So rapidly changing landscape.
Mike, we're obviously talking about Abu Dhabi a lot and the MENA region a bit more generally, and we'll have a lot of rights holders who are perhaps based outside that region but looking in at potential commercial opportunities, at event hosting. What are you seeing from the MENA region that rights holders ought to be aware of, with a particular thought around the sponsorship market?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't see it as being massively different. I think the big question in MENA, as elsewhere, is how quickly things are going to come back post-pandemic. The reality is that the crisis has impacted sort of the different countries in MENA in really, really different ways, and the recovery for all of them is not going to be linear. So the kind of like the main advice that we have is, first of all, be ready for the good news, be ready to deploy when you can. And then in the meantime, think about what you can do to be helpful and connect with your core community. And so kind of like one really good example that caught my eye recently was a tie-up between the Saudi Football Federation and K-Lab Games. So K-Lab Games is the developer of Captain Tsubasa Dream Team. That's a really great example of building a bridge to younger fans in the community. And I think we're going to see a lot of other initiatives like that coming up over the next few months in MENA.
And it's worth saying that we, in partnership with Nielsen, are running a networking call which will dive a little bit more deeply into some of the specifics of sponsorship in the MENA region a little bit later today. And you can access details on the event platform of how to join that. More generally, Mike, what are the benefits? There's obviously a huge amount of data that rights holders now have access to, a whole lot of things that you're measuring at Nielsen. Tell us a little bit about the benefits of looking at all of that holistically. And are there any drawbacks to that kind of general overarching approach?
No, I mean, I think that increasingly we're finding that we're working directly with CFOs in looking at the value of sponsorship investments. And generally at that level, the key is to be able to actually connect up all of the pieces of value into one place. And if you can't do that, then you're going to be kind of coming short. And it's interesting as well that I think we've been working in this kind of holistic way for major brands for quite a long time, but probably the development there is that we're now starting to see some of the world's leading rights holders also working on the same kind of holistic modeling to understand kind of sponsorship value as a whole. So I don't really see any downsides, but there are a couple of really key things that need to be considered when you're looking at return on investment holistically. And probably the most important of them is a kind of an understanding that if you're concentrating on something like sales, the impact that sponsorship is going to have on sales for a sponsor, then that's going to be a story which has a kind of a short-term answer, but also a long-term answer, because the way that sponsorship works is that it accumulates the association over a period of time in consumers' minds between the sponsor and the sponsored property. And so what we find when we put all of this into econometric modeling, and we do a huge amount of that work now, sort of nearly 4,000 different econometric models that we built for different brands recently on that. What we find there is that the relationship between the long term, so when I'm talking about long term, I mean like after year 3 or year 4 of a sponsorship relationship, typically the impact on sales, which is being achieved there, is something like 3 or 4 times greater than the sales impact that you see in the first year. But the great thing is that all of that's predictable, right? So that needs to become part of the way that sponsorship is valued and part of the discussion that happens between sponsors and rights holders.
Mike, around about 30 seconds before we're going to dive headfirst into an ad break. So just time for one last question. And when we spoke in October for Leaders Week Direct, then you said you were broadly optimistic about the health of the sports industry. Probably an underlying emotional tone, I would suggest, of about 6 out of 10 we were reading there. Are you more or less optimistic now?
I continue to be very optimistic, and I wasn't aware that my tone was 6 out of 10 then, but if it was, then I'd probably go to a 7 or a solid 8 at this point. There are 2 things that drive that. One I've already mentioned, which is that I see our marketing clients around the world turning more and more to building plans associated with cause-based and purpose-based marketing, and sport and sponsorship is really one of the best ways of building brands, if that's your objective. But the other part of it is, of course, the rest of the world is changing from a marketing point of view as well. So if we look at the impact of privacy laws, changes in the way that cookies work with digital advertising and other things looking further forward into the future, we can see that, once again, sponsorship, some of those other alternative ways in digital advertising are probably going to become a little harder to work in the way that they're working at the moment, which will then focus brands even more back into sponsorship as a key way of working. So, from my point of view, continue to be very, very positive.
Pleasure, as always, to speak to you, Mike, and I really hope we can do it in person again very soon. Thanks ever so much for joining us.